Okay, welcome everybody to today's class. We're going to look at philosophy or sociology, that kind of thing today. I'm taking today's lesson from Foucault's book called Discipline and Punish. This is what it looks like. Now, Foucault is a fairly modern thinker. He was writing even in the 70s and 80s. So he died not so long ago. And Foucault was certainly he took a lot of inspiration from Nietzsche. So we looked at Nietzsche in the last class, and I hope you can see that some of today's themes are certainly carrying on in the same spirit as Nietzsche's genealogy of morality. And you could consider this book a genealogy of punishment. In this book, Foucault looks at different forms of punishment historically. And he gives a wonderfully, he gives lots of detailed sources for the ideas that he's trying to get across. So he uses a lot of primary sources from history in order to see how punishment has changed over the ages. And I hope that you can see that this is very important even for some of the problems that we're suffering from in today's world. Because this idea of punishment is a very important idea. It's obviously at the basis of any law system, and so it's obviously important in a legal sense, but it's also important in the sense that it is a manifestation of power. We're going to look at different types of power and how power changes over time according to Foucault. So in this book, and as I say, I really enjoyed reading this book. If you're interested in history and if you're interested in crime and punishment, then certainly it's a good book for you to read. Now, he starts by describing what he calls sovereign power. And this is monarchical power. This is the kind of power that's typical in any feudal system or monarchical system. And if we look at the punishments that went on in those days, in those times, in the Middle Ages, what we see is a very different form of punishment than what occurred just a few hundred years later in 17th and 18th centuries. We had a really different system of punishment and a very different system of power according to Foucault. Okay, and so he describes some of these earlier punishments. In particular, he focuses on the regicide, so an attempted murder on the king, and he talks about how what these punishments looked like and what the function was of these punishments. And so certainly there was torture involved. Torture was even involved in the confession. The suspect was often tortured so that he could reveal his truth. And the torture was there to reflect the violence of the original crime. They wanted everybody to see the violence of the original crime. The monarch and certainly the magistrates, the people involved in the legal system, it was a public spectacle. It was theatre. They were public gallows, yeah, where people were killed. It was all done in public. And it was a public execution because it was important to involve the crowd, the people. They had a role to play as well, because it was expected that they would join this ceremony, this ritual, and in that way they would either give their blessing to the judgment that had taken place. They would justify the judgment by also taking part in the public ritual and perhaps clapping, applauding, that kind of thing. Clearly they're giving their blessing to the whole spectacle of justice. But he talks about these forms of punishment in real detail, and one thing that interested me is how meticulous the punishments were. They were really thoroughly explained for each and every case, and the kind of physical punishments that we're dealing with in this form of power, it's violence done to the body. Now we'll see that the form of punishment which develops later is a very different form of punishment, and it involves no external force, or as little as possible, let's say. Whereas in sovereign power, it's the opposite. We're doing violence to the body, and this violence is seen on the body. Often the criminal's body is even exposed to the public for many days afterwards. And it's because any violation of the law is actually an attack on the person of the king. It's an attack on his system of justice, on his system of laws. And so really we're enacting revenge on the culprit. And you can see the executioner, who had a very special position in all of this ritual, as the king's champion. He's the person who represents the king. And so the actual, the number of different systems that were involved in this public execution, the number of different forces that were involved, it's really a complicated process of law. But we can see, if we contrast this very visible form of law, the punishment was always visible, with a very different type of punishment over here, which really occurred after the plague occurred, and we'll deal with that in a second. But the problem with this procedure of sovereign power, of violence to the suspect, violence done to him for the crime that he has committed, is that it has a number of unintended consequences. And that's that sometimes people will feel sympathy for the suspect, for the criminal. Sometimes they'll feel so much sympathy there may be violent protests, they may disagree with the magistrates, they may disagree with the system of justice, and there could even be rebellion. And so there were a number of unintended consequences, and this actually happened a number of times where there were protests or riots after the public execution. So Foucault argues that this was the reason why more and more people, more and more lawmakers, argued in favour of less violence on the body, less sovereign power, less of this very cruel form of punishment, and more in favour of disciplinary power. Yeah, he makes it very clear that even though I think a lot of people today believe that this movement happened for humanitarian reasons, yeah, that more and more people thought, oh, that's cruel and horrible and nasty, we shouldn't do things like that, we should change our system of punishment. But Foucault is more realistic than that. He believes that the humanitarian motives were not the main driver of this movement. And really, it's these unintended consequences which were inefficient for power. And so power was not so powerful, if you like, because of these unintended consequences. And so the system of control, the system of power, the system of government had to change. And so many lawmakers started to argue in favour of a different type of punishment. And this punishment moves towards zero violence done to the body, or as little as possible. Now, of course, Foucault isn't arguing that punishments of physical punishments just disappeared. Even 30 years ago in England, or 40 years ago, we had physical punishments in schools, and so that wouldn't be correct. But he is arguing that more and more and more power utilised a different form of punishment. And this was down to the lawmakers, who could see that this was a more stable system. This system didn't involve external force, and it had a very different approach to punishment. In fact, even its aims were totally different than the punishment in sovereign power. The punishment under the king involved some kind of revenge, and of course it was a very public affair because it had to show everybody that you don't mess with the king. Yeah, you don't violate those laws, otherwise you are violating the laws of absolute power, and he will take absolute revenge on your body. Here it's very different. The aim is to correct the criminal. The aim is to improve the criminal in some kind of way. So very different aims, and to achieve these aims, disciplinary power uses very different methods. So firstly, external force becomes less necessary or unnecessary. The perfect system of disciplinary power doesn't use external force. It's modifying behaviour still with punishments. Any deviations from the norm will be modified with punishments, certainly, but it doesn't, or it punishes as little as possible. It doesn't use external force. Now, this is the birth of the prison, which is, by the way, the subtitle of this book. He's talking about where the prison comes from, because the dungeon of thousands of years ago was not a prison. It was a place where you kept prisoners of war, perhaps, the enemy, perhaps, but it was not a prison for everyday criminals. this institution of the prison was born with disciplinary power. Now, before we go into the detail of what disciplinary power is, and before he goes into the detail of what disciplinary power is, he talks about the plague. Now, the plague is very important in this model, in this idea of how power has changed over time, because the plague is the catalyst for disciplinary power. He has a chapter in here where he talks about disciplinary power that he calls the panopticon, and I'll describe that in a second. It's kind of like his ideal prison, but also his ideal society. Now, when he starts this chapter talking about disciplinary power and panopticon, he spends about 10 pages describing the plague and all the measures, all the restrictions, all the regulations that were put in place at that time. And it's a remarkably interesting account of what exactly they were doing, what the authorities made everyday people do in their houses because of this plague. And when you read this 7 or 8 or 9 pages, what you understand is that it's very similar to what's happening at the moment in all of our lives. That our movement is being restricted, the people that we can meet is being regulated, our identities are being tracked and traced. All of this went on hundreds of years ago during that first plague. And as far as Foucault is concerned, this was what really got disciplinary power moving. This was what gave disciplinary power energy to move forward, these plague measures, all of these restrictions. And he makes a very interesting comparison between the leper of thousands of years ago, who is simply excluded and kept as far away from society as possible, and the plague victim, who isn't excluded but is tracked and traced and marked. It fascinated me, the description of people had to go to their windows, they couldn't go outside, and the person who was like an inspector for that town, he would go from house to house looking at the person to check that they were at the window, to check that they were still home, to check they hadn't gone somewhere else, and it was to check that people weren't hiding the plague, that they weren't hiding somebody with the plague inside. And it's a very interesting point that he's making, but he suggests that disciplinary power, which is all about marking and tracking and tracing, because to modify behaviour, and Foucault talks about 5 particular institutions, but I think he could have chosen more, but these are very important institutions: the factories, the prisons, the schools, the hospitals, the barracks, because in his opinion, all of these institutions owe their existence to disciplinary power. They're based 100% on disciplinary power. And these are institutions that are still very important for everybody nowadays. Crime is an important theme, health, education, all of these themes are constantly discussed in the media. So these are institutions which are still extremely important. And these institutions, you can think of disciplinary power as a method that they used to train people, to improve people, certainly to educate people if we're talking about in schools. But the way in which it did this was a very different system than what came from hundreds of years ago, because the aim was to modify behaviour, and to modify behaviour the students must be watched, or the patients, or the prisoners, or the factory workers, they must be watched. Surveillance and observation become key in this system of disciplinary power. It was fascinating as well to read in here the descriptions of when of the schools where they discuss the toilets, and how the toilets certainly must have a gap at the bottom of the toilet so the teacher can see exactly that they're not messing around in the toilet, that they're definitely sitting on the toilet. It was really interesting description of how strict surveillance and observation was in those times, in those schools. So surveillance and observation is key, and you have to have this feeling as though you're being watched all the time, because then we police ourselves. Okay, now all of these ideas are very utilitarian. If anyone's aware of the utilitarian philosophers, their idea was that the greatest pleasure for the greatest number is the greatest good. And so if you want to do good for your fellow man, you try and make sure as many of them have a fun life, a happy life as possible. Fairly straightforward idea, and very much based on Epicurus back in ancient Greece, who told us that the good was pleasure and bad was pain. So this utilitarian philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, he came up with the idea of the panopticon. And he saw this as the perfect way to educate a child, but also to educate a criminal, and also to look after a patient, because he saw a connection between all of these different institutions. And with the panopticon, it's a certain architecture, but in Foucault's opinion, it's a perfect example of disciplinary power. And it is actually the model that our societies have used as an ideal for hundreds of years. And so it's obviously a very important thing if it's being used as an ideal in health, in education, in crime and punishment as well. So the architecture of this place is that it's a big round circle. You can easily find out about it by putting it into Google. The prison or school or hospital is a large round circle, and all of the patients or pupils or prisoners are in this circle. They're completely transparent, letting light through one side and the other side, although they can't see their fellow convicts or pupils or patients. They're in a cell. And this is something very important in disciplinary power, the idea that each student, each pupil, each patient, each prisoner is in a cell. And they're watched in their cells constantly by the tower in the middle. And the tower in the middle has perfect vision of all the prisoners. So the idea is that you can't see in the tower. There were blinds there or something like that to stop you from seeing if you're being watched. But you are being watched possibly all the time. You don't know because you can't see inside. But this is the idea that you're constantly being watched, but you can't see who's watching you. You can't tell who's watching you. Okay, so that's the idea of the panopticon. And Bentham thought that using this method, we could continually improve people. And they wouldn't be able to team up against the person in the tower because they're not able to communicate with each other. They are isolated, totally isolated. They're not able to socialize. And so because of this isolation, they're not able to team up with the other prisoners, and they'll be totally dominated. Now, the way their behavior is modified is with punishments, sometimes with rewards as well. It's a very different system than sovereign power. Rewards can be used too. Foucault points out that work was always there in these early prisons, and the prisoners received a salary. They received a wage, and this was the utilitarian idea that you give them you make a connection in their heads between work and reward, and they'll become better people. So there are a number of good points about this system, and of course there are a number of bad points as well. There is a total domination going on in this system that's much more powerful than sovereign power. And I believe that Foucault is arguing that far from happening for humanitarian reasons, this took place because power likes to grow, and power became more powerful with disciplinary power. And so disciplinary power infiltrated sovereign power. It didn't replace it. We still have forms of sovereign power. We still have violence done to the body, no doubt about it. But there was an infiltration of disciplinary power, and it created these institutions which acted pretty much in unison. And Foucault points out that the reason why schools and prisons seem similar is because they are similar. They use similar methods in order to train and in order to correct. And really they're using the same kind of philosophy. And this is to create docile bodies ideally suited for work. The ideal here is to get those people back in those factories working. It's efficient. It's better for everybody. Okay, so it's efficiency that's key, that moves us into this disciplinary power. But what really interested me was how the plague, he considers it absolutely essential for moving us into this disciplinary power. And he talks about how leaders dream of the plague because it's a form of total domination. You can bring in extreme measures when life and death is at question. And so extreme measures were brought in. And of course, this is where I'm going with, because we'll talk about today in a second. Now, this isn't really Foucault. I think that this is just something which I'm going to argue in favour of. And I think it's fairly straightforward. I don't think many people would disagree with me here. But with disciplinary power, it's obviously based, it draws together a lot of different disciplines. And of course, it develops a lot of different disciplines as well, because science developed with this, medicine developed with this, psychology developed with this. These are all different disciplines, different subjects. And Foucault's idea is that their origin lies in disciplinary power. They wouldn't be here if we hadn't had this attempt to modify the behaviour of a lot of different people, this new system of punishment. Okay? So these are different institutions, and this is where you can see power acting. And notice that they all act according to the same logic. But what I'm going to argue now, and this isn't in Foucault, but it's that power has changed once again, or is in the process, certainly, of changing. And we can see many of these disciplinary methods, which began in the 17th, 18th century, being used today, certainly. They're not going to disappear. But what we can see is a new form of power infiltrating. And it's a new form of power based certainly on technology, science, and knowledge. Because of course, knowledge and power are connected. And you can see this here, that knowledge, the knowledge of how to modify behaviour, how to correct people, how it increased in a number of different areas, in a number of sciences as well, at this time when disciplinary power came in. And so clearly technology and power and knowledge are all connected. Now, with digital power, the technology now to spread information has obviously got to a point where it's instant, it's instantaneous, it's incredibly fast. In an era of digital power, I would argue that power is invisible. I think power was very visible when you had power there in the institution, in the hierarchy of the institution, that you could easily see from the clothes people were wearing and things like that. You could certainly see power. Power was still visible here, and it was extremely visible here. You know, the punishment was more hidden, but it was not hidden, it was behind high walls. It was in the institutions where the punishment happened. Here, power becomes invisible. And the institutions that we love and respect, such as schools and hospitals and prisons, these institutions are disappearing as they were, as buildings, as institutions. What I'm going to argue is that as the disciplines proliferate, as all of this science and technology and all these different ideas proliferate in society via technology, via science, via the internet, via social media, what we see is that there are no longer physical borders on confinement. There's less and less and less physical confinement with physical walls, with high prison walls, with barbed wire. The walls of the schools are falling down, and the walls of the hospitals are falling down now. And these institutions, which are at the heart of any society, are disappearing. And it's because education and health and even crime and punishment is going to be, or it is already being carried out at home. People are seeing doctors at home. People are having lessons at home. They don't need to go to particular buildings now. They don't even need to go to factories to work. And so these institutions, the walls surrounding these institutions, are disappearing. And it's because these institutions are everywhere now. They've become ubiquitous, just like this digital form of power. They're absolutely everywhere. You never stop learning, you never stop training. Your school life never ends nowadays, yeah? And as for prison, it's everywhere. Notice that we are now in a similar system to a prison, because as you've probably noticed with these extreme measures, we're now isolated. We're no longer allowed to choose who we can associate with. We get regulated visits from friends and family. We get regulated exercise periods, 1 hour per day, no more. and you can see the similarity to a prison. And so there is no need for prison walls anymore. There is no need for prison walls because we have technology. If there is a burglar, we can just strap an electric tag around their leg and say, you don't need to go to prison. You can just, your society is your prison. If you go out after midnight, we will know and we will arrest you again. And notice how that's a much firmer form of control. It's much more control than the sovereign had. And it's using technology. Of course, this has happened as technology and science has developed. So there are no longer any physical borders on confinement, and this is why we see these institutions dying, decaying. No doubt about it, they're gone, they're on their way out, and I think in even as few as 50 years you may no longer see some of these institutions. Many of them will have disappeared. Now, you can think of the world now as a panopticon. And this point has been made many, many times. With CCTV cameras and such like, obviously we're always being watched and tracked and traced anyway. We didn't need these extreme measures to come in. This was a process that was already going on, just as people were already starting to work at home more before any kind of extreme measures took place. This is a process which was going to happen anyway. I don't see it, I see it as an inevitable process. And so as borders disappear, clearly borders around the world disappear. And you get these organisations very often, charitable organisations like Doctors Without Borders, Journalists Without Borders, and of course you've got the UN, the WHO, UNICEF, all of these great and the good global organisations that are there to remind us that borders have disappeared. Now, I don't know about you, but on my Facebook page, it's these guys, it's the UN, the WHO, who are constantly telling me about these new extreme measures. And I want you to realise notice how Foucault's telling you how power is getting softer on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's far more control. People are far more controlled nowadays than they were 1,000 years ago. And sure, the punishment is much softer. There's no external force necessary. Yeah, and here there's confinement, but there's no physical confinement. We're confined to our homes, but there's no wall stopping us from going outside. And so this is a soft form of power. And the punishment itself has got softer and softer and softer, but that doesn't mean that you're less oppressed. Yeah, it doesn't mean that at all, because actually you are more controlled, you are more manipulated than you ever were under sovereign power. And so these extreme measures have come in, including, you can see how these are standard punishments for prisoners or school children. Yeah, these are standard punishments. We send school children into isolation. We say, get out of the class. We regulate school children's visits to their friends and our children when we're bringing them up. We regulate their exercise, we regulate their movements. Notice how you can't go in a shop anymore without being regulated in your movement. And there are, by the way, some fascinating descriptions of soldiers marching in Disciplinary Power in the Foucault book, and in handwriting in schools. The level of detail of where the finger had to be, where the leg had to be, where the elbow had to be is astonishing. It literally is just like those soldiers who have to learn how to do certain manoeuvres and procedures in a very specific way. Well, children handwriting, have a look at how they used to have to write and how they had to hold the pen, how their leg used to have to be in a certain place. And it's astonishing how much control was being exerted over these poor youngsters who had just wanted to write. Yeah. So we have all of these extreme measures. We have another plague. Yeah, it's another plague. What kind of power will this be the catalyst for? Obviously, that's the question that's interesting for me. And I want to remind you that with this plague, this is a state of exception. It's a state of emergency, if you prefer. But this is a very strange situation where the law no longer applies. Somebody goes above the law, or some organisation or some group, some party goes above the law and says the laws don't count anymore because we're in such a terrible pandemic, because we're in such a terrible situation. And there are very interesting arguments here, if you're interested in this kind of thing. Have a read of the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, and have a read of Carl Schmitt, who is a German lawyer, I believe, but who argued strongly in favour of the state of exception during the reign of the Nazis, during Hitler's time. And he looks at the whole period and justifies that state of emergency. He justifies these extreme measures. If you want to read an interesting opinion from the other side of the debate, have a look at this Italian guy, Giorgio Agamben. He argues that the state of emergency is a state of terror, and it's the totalitarian state. It's exactly what the totalitarian state is. It's when the leader decides that laws don't count for him or for his party or for his elite, and they only count for others. I'd argue that that's exactly what we're dealing with now with these extreme measures. I'm not in favour of the lockdown restrictions, and I actually believe that we're heading down a very dark path if we continue in this direction. So I'm a big fan of Agamben, but thanks everybody for watching this class. If you enjoy this topic, please get Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish. It's a fascinating study of power and punishment and pestilence. Yeah, please, if you've enjoyed the class, give us a like. If you've got any comments about what's going on at the moment, please feel free to share them under the video, and I hope to see you all soon.